The evening was painted in luxurious tones, with glittering chandeliers illuminating the grand ballroom. The air buzzed with quiet sophistication, a mix of soft laughter, hushed conversations, and the clinking of crystal glasses. The charity event was the social highlight of the season, drawing in the city's wealthiest elite, high-ranking officials and philanthropists. Among them was Amara James, a black woman in her late 30s, tall and poised, moving with effortless grace through the crowd. Her dark, elegant dress hugged her athletic frame, and her expression remained composed yet observant. There was something about the way she carried herself that commanded respect and attention. But Amara was more than just another guest. Unknown to most of the attendees, she wasn't here merely to enjoy the soiree. She was, in fact, the key figure behind the entire event, an experienced philanthropist, the head organizer, and one of the largest donors to the cause. This charity gala wasn't just about raising money for underprivileged children, it was an intricate web of high-stakes players, each one more influential than the last. What no one knew was that for Amara, this evening held a dual purpose. She wasn't only here to support the cause but also to secretly pursue a much darker mission. A mission that involved unraveling the city's deep-seated corruption that reached into the highest levels of power. To Amara, this mission wasn't just another job. It was personal. Years ago, her family had been torn apart by the same corrupt system she was now seeking to dismantle. Her younger brother had been falsely accused and wrongfully imprisoned, all because of an elaborate cover-up orchestrated by powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Since that tragic incident, Amara had dedicated her life to bringing down the system from within, using her position in high society as a shield and weapon. Tonight, everything was set in motion. She knew that one wrong move could put her entire mission, and perhaps her life, in danger. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Officer Glenn Hardman stood near the entrance, scanning the room with a look of disinterest. Hardman was in his early 40s, a seasoned cop who had seen it all. His job that night was simple: to provide extra security for the event, ensure nothing went wrong, and watch over the city's finest as they exchanged pleasantries over champagne. But Hardman felt out of place. He wasn't used to such glamorous surroundings, and being surrounded by the rich and powerful only served to irritate him. Beneath his calm exterior, he harbored deep resentment toward people who he believed had always looked down on men like him, those from the working class, struggling to make ends meet while the wealthy flaunted their success. And now here he was, standing guard for the very people he despised. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes fell on Amara. She wasn't a typical guest. Hardman couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about her seemed out of place. She didn't fit the mold of the other attendees, despite her elegant appearance. There was an air of control around her, a sharpness in the way she moved through the room. Her confidence, instead of easing Hardman's mind, made him suspicious. He had developed a sense over the years, one that told him when something wasn't right. And now, his instincts were telling him to keep an eye on her. Amara, while engaged in conversation with some local officials, was always aware of her surroundings. She had been trained for situations like this. As a former operative, she knew when she was being watched. She had felt Hardman's eyes on her from the moment she entered the ballroom, and while she kept up the appearance of relaxed sophistication, every fiber of her being was on alert. She had come to the event prepared, dressed to blend in, but beneath the surface, her mind was running through multiple scenarios. She had to be careful tonight. There were people here who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her if they knew what she was really after. As the night progressed, Amara noticed a man at the far end of the room, a tall, distinguished figure in his 50s, his graying hair neatly combed back, his suit perfectly tailored. He was James Whitlock, a major political figure, and one of the people Amara had been investigating for months. Whitlock had carefully crafted a public image as a benevolent leader, but behind the scenes, he was deeply involved in an international corruption ring that Amara had been slowly piecing together. His presence at the gala wasn't surprising, but what caught her attention was the brief exchange he had with another man, a nondescript individual in a plain suit who passed Whitlock a small black envelope before quickly disappearing into the crowd. Amara's instincts sharpened. That envelope could be the final piece of the puzzle she had been working on for so long. If she could get her hands on it, she might finally have the evidence she needed to take Whitlock and his entire network down. But she knew this wouldn't be easy. Whitlock was a man surrounded by security, and any attempt to get close to him would be fraught with danger. On the other side of the room, Hardman's gaze hadn't left Amara. He had seen the exchange too, but from his perspective, it looked like a shady deal. He didn't know who Amara was, but in his mind, she had become the prime suspect in whatever was going on. Hardman didn't trust her. In his eyes, she was too calm, too confident. And in a room full of people who liked to show off their wealth, her understated elegance made her seem even more suspicious. He began moving through the crowd, subtly positioning himself closer to her. Amara, feeling Hardman's approach, knew she had to act fast. She couldn't afford to let herself be drawn into a confrontation, especially not with security. As Whitlock moved toward the exit, Amara saw her chance. She gracefully excused herself from the conversation she was having and made her way toward the door, her movements smooth and unhurried, as though she were merely taking a break from the festivities. Hardman, however, wasn't fooled. He followed her, weaving through the crowd, his suspicion growing by the second. As Amara stepped out of the ballroom into a quieter hallway, she quickly glanced around. The envelope Whitlock had received had to be somewhere nearby. She couldn't risk losing it, but just as she turned a corner, she felt a heavy hand land on her shoulder. Hardman had caught up to her, and his grip was firm. "Where do you think you're going?" Hardman's voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it. He had already made up his mind that she was involved in something illegal. Amara, her heart pounding, turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I'm just stepping outside for some fresh air," she replied smoothly, keeping her voice steady. Hardman's eyes narrowed. He wasn't buying it. "I saw you. That little exchange back there. You want to explain what that was about?" Amara's mind raced. She needed to diffuse the situation without drawing too much attention. She couldn't risk being caught in a confrontation here. Not now. Not when she was so close to her goal. Amara's pulse quickened as Officer Hardman's eyes bore into hers, his grip tightening on her shoulder. She could sense that this situation was slipping out of her control, and fast. Hardman wasn't the kind of officer who could be reasoned with easily. His suspicion had already rooted itself, and now she was firmly in his sights. She had to think quickly, but any wrong move could destroy everything she had worked for. This night had been planned down to the smallest detail, and now a single cop with a personal grudge was threatening to unravel it all. "Look," she began, keeping her voice calm, "I'm not sure what you think you saw, but I'm just here as an organizer for the event. I've been coordinating all night." Hardman wasn't convinced. He'd seen that exchange, how Amara had taken the envelope, how she'd seemed far too composed for someone merely enjoying a party. The fact that she was moving through the event without attracting attention only raised more red flags for him. This wasn't a woman who belonged with the elites. This was someone with a secret, and he intended to find out what it was. "You're not fooling me," Hardman growled, his eyes narrowing. "What was in that envelope? Drugs? Money? You think you can just walk in here and make your shady deals without being noticed?" Amara inwardly sighed. This wasn't going to be easy. She was a skilled agent, but even the best plans couldn't always account for a determined officer with a grudge. She quickly assessed her options. Drawing attention to herself was the last thing she needed. Hardman's instincts, though rooted in bias, were going to make him relentless. If she tried to bluff her way out of this, he'd likely escalate the situation. But if she was honest and revealed too much, the whole operation could be compromised. She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Why are you so interested in me? Shouldn't you be more concerned with what's happening in there?" She gestured back toward the ballroom, hoping to divert his attention. But Hardman wasn't biting. He crossed his arms, stepping closer, closing the gap between them. "What's in the envelope?" he repeated, his voice low and threatening. Amara's thoughts raced. She couldn't give him the envelope. The information inside wasn't just sensitive, it was explosive. It contained details that could bring down the entire corrupt network she had spent months uncovering. James Whitlock, the politician who'd been exchanging secrets with the city's elite, was the key figure. He had been using his influence to siphon public funds into offshore accounts, all while positioning himself as a philanthropist. The men and women at this event were all, knowingly or unknowingly, part of the network that was funding his illegal operations. The contents of that envelope were evidence, a final piece of the puzzle. But she couldn't just let Hardman get his hands on it. Seeing no other way, Amara made a decision. She subtly slipped her hand into her pocket, reaching for the small recording device she always carried. She needed to record this interaction, in case things spiraled further out of control. With her thumb, she activated it, hoping it would go unnoticed by Hardman. "I don't know what you think is happening here," she said evenly, "but if you're going to accuse me of something, I'd prefer you do it properly." Hardman smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, I planned to. I know you're hiding something, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. So why don't we step outside for a little chat?" He gestured toward the emergency exit, a dimly lit corridor that led out to the side of the building. Amara's heart skipped a beat. If he got her alone, things could go very wrong. She couldn't afford to be sidelined right now. The timing was too delicate, the stakes too high. She scanned the hallway, noting the position of the cameras. Luckily, none were pointed directly at them. Hardman, in his arrogance, hadn't even thought to check for surveillance. She filed that away in her mind. As he began steering her toward the exit, Amara caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. It was Whitlock, stepping out of the ballroom with his entourage, the envelope still tucked into his jacket pocket. She couldn't let him leave with that evidence. If he made it out, all her work, all her sacrifices, would be for nothing. She needed to act now. With a quick, calculated move, Amara twisted her arm out of Hardman's grip, surprising him with her speed. Before he could react, she was already a few steps ahead, slipping into the crowd. Hardman, caught off guard, shouted after her, but his voice was swallowed by the noise of the party. Amara's mind raced. She needed to get to Whitlock before he disappeared into the night. She could feel Hardman pursuing her, but the ballroom was packed, making it hard for him to catch up. Amara weaved through the guests, her movements smooth and unhurried, so as not to attract too much attention. But inside, her pulse was racing. She spotted Whitlock near the exit, exchanging pleasantries with a group of businessmen. He was good at hiding his true nature, always smiling, always polite, the perfect politician. But Amara knew the truth. She had seen the damage he had caused, the lives he had ruined. And now, he was about to walk out of here with enough evidence to bury any investigation against him. Amara quickened her pace, closing the gap between them. But just as she was about to reach Whitlock, she felt a strong hand clamp down on her arm. Hardman had caught up. His face was flushed with anger, and he wasn't going to let her go this time. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, pulling her toward him. Amara gritted her teeth, struggling to maintain her composure. This was spiraling out of control. Hardman wasn't just a nuisance anymore, he was a real threat to the success of her mission. Whitlock, sensing the commotion behind him, glanced over his shoulder. His eyes met Amara's for a brief moment, and she saw something flicker in his gaze. Recognition. He knew who she was. And that's when everything changed. Whitlock's smile faltered, and without missing a beat, he turned and made his way toward the exit, moving faster than before. He wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. He needed to get out of there, and fast. Amara cursed under her breath. Whitlock was slipping away, and she was stuck dealing with Hardman. She had seconds to decide what to do. With one quick movement, Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device. Before Hardman could react, she pressed the button, and a sharp, high-pitched noise filled the air. It was a sonic disruptor, a tool she carried for situations just like this. The sound was piercing, disorienting anyone within a few feet of her. Hardman let go of her arm, momentarily stunned by the noise. His hands flew to his ears as he stumbled back, giving Amara just enough time to break free. Without wasting another second, she darted toward the exit, her eyes locked on Whitlock. She couldn't let him get away. Not now. Amara's heart raced as she dashed through the elegant corridors, her mind calculating every possible outcome. She had shaken Officer Hardman, but not for long. He was relentless, and she knew he wouldn't give up easily. More concerning, though, was James Whitlock. He was too close to the exit, too close to slipping away with the evidence that could bring down his entire operation. She couldn't let that happen. Not after everything she'd sacrificed to get this far. The ballroom had become a maze of obstacles, well-dressed guests, waitstaff carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres, and the ever-watchful security guards positioned at key points. Amara knew she had to act quickly but quietly. Drawing attention to herself in this environment could ruin everything. But if Whitlock escaped, her mission would be a failure. The delicate balance between subtlety and urgency pressed heavily on her. She kept her eyes locked on Whitlock's retreating figure as he made his way toward the VIP exit at the far end of the room. His confident stride made it clear that he thought he was untouchable, that no one could stop him. Amara smirked to herself. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She moved swiftly but gracefully, weaving between groups of guests, her eyes darting around the room, scanning for any additional threats. Hardman was somewhere behind her, undoubtedly regaining his composure after the sonic disruptor. She had bought herself a few precious moments, but those wouldn't last long. If she didn't reach Whitlock soon, she might lose him for good. As Amara neared the exit, she saw two of Whitlock's bodyguards standing by the door, scanning the room with sharp eyes. They were professionals, trained to notice any unusual movement, any threat. Getting past them wouldn't be easy, but Amara had faced worse. She quickly assessed her options, her mind running through a mental list of the tools at her disposal. She didn't have time for a full-on confrontation. She needed something subtle, something that would incapacitate them without causing a scene. Reaching into her bag, she discreetly pulled out a small vial of clear liquid. It was a custom-made neurotoxin, harmless in small doses, but potent enough to cause temporary paralysis in anyone who inhaled it. She palmed the vial and continued moving toward the bodyguards, maintaining her calm exterior as if she were just another guest heading toward the exit. As she neared them, she slowed her pace, allowing herself to blend in with the other guests around her. The bodyguards glanced at her, but didn't seem particularly alarmed after all. She looked the part of a wealthy, high society guest. But Amara knew how to use perception to her advantage. People rarely saw what they weren't expecting. In one smooth motion, she pretended to stumble, bumping into one of the bodyguards. As she did, she expertly dropped the vial, allowing it to shatter on the floor at their feet. The liquid evaporated instantly, releasing a barely noticeable mist into the air. The bodyguards barely had time to react before the neurotoxin began to take effect. Their muscles tensed, their movements slowed, and within seconds, they were paralyzed, standing rigidly by the door, as if nothing had happened. Amara stepped past them without missing a beat, her heart pounding but her face betraying none of the tension she felt. She was almost there. Whitlock was only a few feet away now, standing near the exit, engaged in a low conversation with another man. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she didn't need to. All that mattered was getting the envelope. But just as she reached for it, Whitlock turned, his eyes locking onto hers. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. He recognized her. The realization flickered across his face, followed by a dark, dangerous smile. Well, he said, his voice smooth and dripping with arrogance. I didn't expect to see you here, Miss James. Or should I say, Agent James. Amara's blood ran cold. He knew. I must say, Whitlock continued, his smile widening, I've been following your little investigation for some time now. Impressive work, really. But I'm afraid this is where your journey ends. He gave a subtle nod, and before Amara could react, the man standing next to Whitlock lunged at her. She barely had time to block his attack, her instincts kicking in as she twisted out of the way. The man was fast, a trained fighter, and he wasn't going to make this easy. Amara countered with a swift kick to his midsection, sending him stumbling backward, but he quickly recovered, charging at her again. The fight was fast and brutal. Amara moved with precision, her training in hand-to-hand combat allowing her to hold her own against the larger man. But the ballroom was a dangerous place for a fight, too many witnesses, too many variables. She couldn't afford to draw any more attention. As they exchanged blows, Amara caught a glimpse of Whitlock out of the corner of her eye. He was watching them, a smug expression on his face, as if he were enjoying the spectacle. He didn't seem worried. He thought he was untouchable, that his bodyguard would take care of her. But Whitlock had underestimated her. Amara feinted left, drawing the man off balance, then delivered a sharp elbow to his jaw, knocking him to the ground. She didn't wait for him to recover. Instead, she turned her attention back to Whitlock, who was already reaching for the door. No, you don't, she muttered under her breath. She sprinted toward him, her eyes locked on the envelope still tucked inside his jacket. Whitlock's eyes widened as he realized she was coming for him, and he turned, throwing open the door and bolting down the hallway. Amara didn't hesitate. She burst through the door after him, her feet pounding against the marble floors as she chased him down the long, narrow corridor. The hallway was dimly lit, the exit at the far end looming like a beacon. Whitlock was fast, but Amara was faster. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, driving her forward. Just as she was about to catch up to him, the door at the far end of the hallway swung open, and 3 more of Whitlock's men stepped into the corridor, blocking her path. Amara skidded to a stop, her mind racing. She was trapped. Whitlock had planned this. He had been ready for her. The men closed in on her, their expressions cold and professional. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to end this. Amara backed up slowly, her eyes darting between the men, searching for any possible escape. She couldn't fight all three of them at once, not in this narrow hallway. But she wasn't going to go down without a fight. "Whitlock," she called out, her voice echoing down the corridor. "You can't run forever. I have everything I need to take you down." Whitlock paused, turning to face her. He looked amused, as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Oh, Amara," he said, shaking his head. "You really think you can win this? You're in over your head. You don't know who you're dealing with." Amara gritted her teeth. "I know exactly who you are, and when I'm done with you, the whole world will know too." Whitlock's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that." He nodded to his men, and they moved in, their fists clenched, ready to take her down. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she prepared herself for the fight of her life. She couldn't let them capture her. Not here, not now. She had to get out of this, had to find a way to escape and finish what she started. But before the men could reach her, a loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by a series of heavy footsteps. Amara's heart leapt as she recognized the sound backup had arrived. Hardman. Hardman. He appeared at the far end of the hallway, his gun drawn, his face set in grim determination. He didn't say a word he didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to send a ripple of uncertainty through Whitlock's men. They hesitated, glancing at each other, unsure of what to do. Amara seized the opportunity. With a quick, fluid motion, she pulled a small device from her belt, a tactical smoke grenade. She tossed it to the ground, and within seconds, the corridor was filled with thick, billowing smoke. "Go," she shouted at Hardman, her voice muffled by the smoke. "We need to catch Whitlock." Hardman nodded, covering her as they sprinted down the hallway, the smoke concealing their movements. Whitlock was still ahead, but they were closing in. Amara could feel the tension in the air, the sense of urgency pressing down on them. Whitlock was desperate now, and that made him dangerous. If they didn't stop him soon, he would disappear, and everything she had worked for would be lost. As they burst through the exit doors and into the cool night air, Amara caught sight of Whitlock climbing into a sleek black car, his driver revving the engine, ready to speed off. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the car, her legs burning with the effort. She couldn't let him get away. Not now, not when she was so close. Whitlock glanced back at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with panic. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. He knew she was coming for him, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop her. But just as Amara reached the car, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle shot forward, tires screeching against the pavement. She lunged for the door, her fingers grazing the handle, but it was too late. The car sped off into the night, disappearing around the corner in a blur of black metal and taillights. Amara stood there, panting, her chest heaving with frustration. Whitlock had gotten away. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cold night air filled Amara's lungs as she stood at the edge of the alley, watching Whitlock's car vanish into the distance. Her mind raced. This was supposed to be the moment where she closed the case, where she finally had Whitlock in her grasp along with the evidence that could bring down an entire network of corruption and crime. Now, everything was slipping through her fingers, and all she had left was the scent of burnt rubber from Whitlock's escape. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. Panic wouldn't help. The mission wasn't over. Whitlock was still in play, and as long as she could track him, she had a chance to finish this. But now, standing beside her, Officer Hardman was panting heavily, catching his breath after their pursuit. He holstered his gun and gave her a hard, unreadable look, as though trying to figure out exactly what had just happened. He was supposed to be her problem, another obstacle in a night full of complications, but instead he had shown up just when she needed him. Was he on her side now, or was he just in too deep to back out? What the hell was that all about? Hardman finally demanded, still eyeing her with suspicion, but now tempered with curiosity. The tone in his voice had changed. He wasn't just accusing her of being part of a criminal operation anymore. He had seen enough to know that this wasn't some petty scheme. Something much bigger was happening, and Amara was at the center of it. Amara didn't answer right away. She was still trying to process everything. The mission had gone off script, and now Hardman was a part of it. But how much could she trust him? He had been nothing but a thorn in her side up until now, his narrow-minded assumptions almost costing her everything. Yet here he was, having chased down Whitlock's men, having protected her when things spiraled out of control. But could she risk letting him in on the truth? "Officer Hardman," she said slowly, keeping her voice measured, "you're in way over your head. This isn't just about some deal you think you saw back there. This goes far beyond that." Hardman crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "I don't like games, Miss James. I saw what I saw. That guy Whitlock, he's dirty. I know it. So why are you chasing him? What's really going on here?" Amara's jaw tightened. She didn't have time to bring him up to speed. Whitlock had slipped away, and she needed to figure out his next move. But Hardman wasn't going anywhere he was too deep in now, and leaving him in the dark would only make things worse. She could either try to shake him, which would waste precious time, or she could tell him just enough to get him to cooperate. She needed him on her side, at least for the moment. Taking a deep breath, Amara turned to face him fully. "You're right. Whitlock is dirty more than you could possibly know. I've been investigating him and his network for months now. Corruption, embezzlement, fraud, it's all tied to him. But it's not just about money. There are people in high places involved in this. People who would do anything to protect themselves." Hardman's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the sound of this. "And you? What are you? FBI? CIA?" "Neither," she said, her voice steady. "I'm part of an international task force that investigates high-level corruption and organized crime. My cover was blown tonight, thanks to you. Now Whitlock knows I'm on his trail." Hardman bristled at the accusation, but didn't deny it. "So what's the play here? You planning on taking him down by yourself?" "I was," Amara replied, her tone sharp. "But now, thanks to your interference, we have to act fast. Whitlock's running scared, which means he's either going to make a mistake, or he's going to disappear completely. I can't afford to let that happen. Neither can you." Hardman stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. He was processing everything, trying to decide if he believed her. Finally he spoke, his voice low and hard. "If what you're saying is true, and this is as big as you claim it is, why the hell haven't you brought in the local authorities? We've got a whole precinct." "I don't trust your precinct," Amara cut in, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know who's compromised. Whitlock has people everywhere, including law enforcement. The moment you bring in the wrong person, this entire operation falls apart. The only reason I've made it this far is by working in the shadows." The weight of her words hung between them. Hardman's face darkened as he realized what she was implying: his own colleagues could be involved. People he had worked with for years could be dirty, and he had no way of knowing for sure. The thought chilled him, but deep down, something about it rang true. Whitlock had that kind of power. And "So what now?" Hardman asked, his voice softer, but no less intense. Amara's eyes flicked down the empty street where Whitlock's car had disappeared. "Now we find Whitlock before he vanishes for good. He's rattled, and that makes him dangerous. But it also makes him sloppy. I have a few leads, but time isn't on our side. We have to move fast." Hardman nodded slowly, though it was clear he still had reservations. "You think he's going to go underground?" "No," Amara said, shaking her head, "not yet. He's going to try to secure the evidence first. Whitlock's smart, but his ego is even bigger. He won't run until he's absolutely sure he's safe. That means he's going to tie up loose ends, destroy any remaining evidence, and probably contact his associates. That's where we'll get him." She paused, then added, "I need access to police resources, surveillance, traffic cameras, and any intel you have on his known locations." Hardman hesitated. "You're asking me to go rogue. If I do this, I'm putting everything on the line. My career, hell, my life." Amara met his gaze, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not asking you to go rogue. I'm asking you to do what's right. Whitlock and his people have been playing the system for years, and no one stopped them. This is your chance to change that. But you have to decide if you're willing to cross that line." Hardman swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. He had spent his entire career following the rules, playing it by the book, but where had that gotten him? In a corrupt system, playing by the rules only meant you were playing into the hands of the people who had rigged the game. For the first time in his career, he realized that maybe doing the right thing meant breaking a few rules. "Fine," he said, his voice resolute. "But if we're doing this, we do it right. No shortcuts. I need to know everything, every detail, every player involved. No more secrets." Amara nodded. "Agreed. But first we need to get out of here before anyone realizes what's happened. If Whitlock's men come looking, we don't want to be around when they do." With that, the two of them hurried back down the alley, slipping into the shadows as they made their way toward Hardman's patrol car. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, but Amara knew that the calm wouldn't last. Whitlock was scrambling to cover his tracks, and that meant things were about to get messy. As they reached the car, Hardman got behind the wheel while Amara slid into the passenger seat. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of what they were about to do hanging between them. "So where do we start?" Hardman asked, glancing at her. Amara pulled out her phone, scrolling through encrypted messages from her contacts. "I have a lead on one of Whitlock's safe houses. It's not far from here. We start there. If we're lucky, he'll have left something behind. If not, we'll move to Plan B." Hardman frowned. Plan B. Amara's lips twitched in a faint smile. Plan B is less subtle. Hardman grunted but didn't press for more details. He had a feeling he wasn't going to like Plan B, whatever it was. As they drove through the quiet streets, the tension in the car was palpable. Amara was focused, her mind already several steps ahead, calculating every possible move Whitlock might make. She had been chasing him for so long that she knew his patterns, his habits. He was predictable in his arrogance, and that was something she could use against him. But Hardman was more cautious. He had spent years on the streets, dealing with criminals of all kinds, and one thing he knew for sure was that desperate men were dangerous. Whitlock had the resources to go underground, to disappear completely if he wanted to. But something told Hardman that Whitlock wasn't done yet. Men like him didn't run. They doubled down. "Listen," Hardman said, breaking the silence. "I don't know how deep this goes, But if there's anyone inside the department working with Whitlock, we need to be careful. One wrong move, and we could end up walking into a trap. Amara nodded. I know. That's why we're going dark. No calls, no radios. Just you and me. We can't trust anyone else. The weight of that statement hung in the air. Hardman wasn't used to working like this without backup, without the safety net of his badge. But he had made his choice. There was no turning back now. As they approached the location of Whitlock's safe house, Amara felt a familiar sense of anticipation creeping over her. This was the moment where everything could shift. If they found something inside anything that tied Whitlock to his network, they would have the leverage they needed to bring him down. But if Whitlock had already cleared out, they would be back at square one, and Amara wasn't sure how many more chances they would get. The car slowed as they pulled up to a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It looked like any other office building, but Amara knew better. Whitlock's people had chosen it specifically because it blended in, because no one would suspect what was really going on inside. This is it, Amara said quietly, her eyes scanning the building. Stay sharp. We don't know what we'll find in there. Hardman nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his holstered gun. Let's do this. The streetlights flickered ominously as Amara and Hardman approached the nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. The cool night air felt heavy, thick with the tension of what lay ahead. This was no ordinary office building. It was one of Whitlock's safe houses, and if they were lucky, they might catch him off guard or find anything that would blow the case wide open. But both Amara and Hardman knew that what they were about to do was dangerous. Whitlock was desperate now, and desperate men made deadly moves. Hardman parked the car in the shadows a few blocks away. He turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, staring at the building in front of them. The place looked abandoned, with no signs of life visible from the street, but Amara knew better. She had studied Whitlock's operations for months, and he always chose locations that looked unassuming, the kind of place people wouldn't give a second glance. We go in quiet, Amara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't know what's inside or how many people we're dealing with. Whitlock might be here, or he might have left someone behind to clean up his tracks. Either way, we need to be ready for anything. Hardman nodded, the tension in his jaw betraying the calm facade he was trying to maintain. He checked his gun, the metal cold in his hands, before glancing over at Amara. Despite everything they had been through, he still didn't entirely trust her. She had dragged him into a world of shadows, corruption, and high-level deceit that he had only glimpsed from afar during his years on the force. Now, he was in the middle of it. And whether he liked it or not, he was on her side for now. Do you have any idea what we're looking for in there? He asked, breaking the silence. Amara scanned the building, her mind running through every piece of intel she had gathered. Whitlock's been sloppy since the gala. He didn't expect me to get this close. He'll be moving his assets, covering his tracks. That means he might have left something behind: documents, encrypted devices, anything that ties him to the offshore accounts and the politicians he's been paying off. And if we don't find anything? Hardman asked, his voice edged with skepticism. We will, Amara said confidently, though inside the weight of uncertainty pressed against her. She couldn't afford to show doubt now. Not when they were so close. They exited the car and made their way toward the building, sticking to the shadows as they approached the side entrance. The building looked dilapidated up close, with cracked windows and peeling paint, but Amara knew the inside would tell a different story. Whitlock's men would have made it secure, with high-tech equipment and reinforced locks to keep prying eyes away. The facade was nothing more than camouflage. Amara knelt beside the door, pulling out a small toolkit from her bag. She glanced over at Hardman, who had his gun drawn, standing guard while she worked. Within seconds, the lock clicked open with a soft snick. Amara stood up, motioning for Hardman to follow her inside. They slipped through the door, closing it quietly behind them. The interior of the building was dimly lit, the air thick with the musty scent of neglect. They stood in a long, narrow hallway, lined with doors on either side. The faint hum of electrical equipment could be heard in the distance. Amara's senses were on high alert. Every nerve in her body was telling her that danger was close, but they had no choice but to move forward. "Stay close," she whispered, her eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. They moved silently, each step careful and deliberate. As they passed the first few doors, Amara resisted the urge to check them, knowing that their goal was deeper inside the building. If Whitlock had left anything behind, it would be in the secure areas further in. The first few rooms were likely decoys, meant to throw off anyone who might come snooping. As they reached the end of the hallway, they found a heavy steel door with a keypad lock. Amara crouched down, examining the device. It was a high-end security system, one she recognized from her years in the field. This wasn't something an ordinary criminal would install. Whitlock had spared no expense in protecting his secrets. "Can you get through it?" Hardman asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder. He had the uneasy feeling that they were being watched, though the building had seemed deserted when they entered. Amara didn't answer immediately, her fingers working deftly to dismantle the lock. She was used to this kind of pressure. Every second mattered, but she couldn't afford to make a mistake. If the security system triggered an alarm, they could be dealing with armed men descending on them in minutes. Finally, with a soft click, the door unlocked. Amara pushed it open, revealing a darkened room beyond. She stepped inside cautiously, Hardman following close behind, his gun raised. The room was filled with high-tech equipment servers, monitors, and a large metal desk covered in papers. Amara's eyes immediately went to the screens, which were still active. Someone had been here recently. She hurried over to the desk, scanning the documents for anything useful. "Bingo," she muttered under her breath, as she picked up a sheet of paper detailing a list of offshore accounts, complete with coded references to various politicians and business leaders. This was the evidence she needed. This was what could take down Whitlock and expose the entire network. But before she could say anything to Hardman, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Amara froze, her eyes meeting Hardman's. Someone was coming. "We're not alone," Hardman whispered, his grip tightening on his gun. Amara quickly pocketed the documents and moved to the side of the door, motioning for Hardman to take cover. They waited in tense silence as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be stealthy. The heavy thud of boots on the floor told Amara that they were dealing with more than one person. The door swung open, and two armed men entered the room, their guns drawn. Amara acted without hesitation. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the nearest man by the arm, twisting it behind his back and disarming him before he could react. Hardman fired a shot, hitting the second man in the leg, sending him crumpling to the floor with a pained cry. The first man struggled in Amara's grip, but she tightened her hold, pinning him against the wall. "Who sent you?" she demanded, her voice cold and controlled. The man gritted his teeth, refusing to answer, but Amara didn't have time for games. She twisted his arm further, eliciting a sharp gasp of pain. "Talk," she ordered. Whitlock, the man spat through clenched teeth. "He knew you'd come. He's gone. Took everything." Amara's stomach sank. If Whitlock had anticipated her move, then he was already several steps ahead. But the fact that he had left these men behind meant one thing: he was still cleaning up, still tying off loose ends. He wasn't gone yet. There was still time. She glanced at Hardman, who was keeping his gun trained on the second man. "We need to move. Now." "What about them?" Hardman asked, nodding toward the injured man on the floor. "They're not going anywhere," Amara replied, her voice hard. "But Whitlock is." She released the first man, who slid to the floor, clutching his arm in pain. Without another word, she and Hardman slipped out of the room, making their way back down the hallway. Amara's mind was racing. She had the evidence, but it wasn't enough. Whitlock could still wriggle out of this if he had time to cover his tracks completely. They had to catch him in the act. As they reached the exit, Amara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an encrypted message from one of her contacts, a mole she had planted in Whitlock's operation months ago. The message was brief but clear. "Whitlock heading to safe house in the industrial district. Final cleanup." Amara's heart raced. This was it. Whitlock was making his last move, and if they were fast enough, they could catch him in the act. "We have a location," Amara said, showing the message to Hardman. "He's going to the industrial district. If we move now, we can intercept him." Hardman didn't hesitate. "Let's go." They sprinted back to the car, adrenaline coursing through their veins. As they sped through the city streets, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. This was their last chance. If Whitlock managed to slip away again, everything would be lost. The industrial district loomed ahead, its darkened warehouses casting long shadows under the streetlights. Amara scanned the area as they approached, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Whitlock wouldn't come here without protection. There would be more men, more guns, and more obstacles standing between them and their target. Hardman pulled the car to a stop a few blocks away from the location, turning off the headlights to avoid drawing attention. They exited the car and moved quickly but quietly toward the warehouse where Whitlock was supposedly holed up. As they neared the building, Amara's phone buzzed again. Another message from her contact. "He's here. Armed guards. Be careful." Amara slipped the phone back into her pocket, her pulse quickening. They were close. So close. "This is it," she whispered to Hardman. "We get in, we take him down, and we end this." Hardman nodded, his expression grim. "Let's finish this." They crept toward the warehouse, using the shadows for cover. The faint sound of voices reached their ears. Guards stationed at the entrance, just as her contact had warned. Amara knew they couldn't afford to go in guns blazing. They needed to be smart, to use the element of surprise. She motioned for Hardman to follow her as they circled around the building, looking for another way in. Finally, they found a side door, unguarded but locked. Amara quickly picked the lock, and they slipped inside, moving through the darkened corridors with practiced precision. The warehouse was a maze of crates and machinery, but Amara's instincts guided her toward the center. That's where Whitlock would be protected by his men, finishing the final stages of his operation. As they moved deeper into the building, the tension grew thicker. Every step felt heavier, every sound more pronounced. Amara's senses were on high alert, every muscle in her body coiled and ready for action. Finally, they reached the heart of the warehouse, and there he was, James Whitlock, standing beside a table covered in documents, his back to them. He was flanked by 2 armed guards, both of whom were scanning the room, unaware of Amara and Hardman's presence. Amara exchanged a quick glance with Hardman. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. Without a word, they moved into position, ready to strike. But just as Amara was about to make her move, Whitlock turned around, his eyes locking onto hers. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "You're too late," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "I've already won." Whitlock's mocking smile sent a chill down Amara's spine. He stood confidently, knowing he had prepared for this moment. His guards flanked him, guns ready, their eyes cold and unyielding. The warehouse, with its labyrinth of crates and shadows, suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic. The air was thick with tension, and Amara could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. "Too late," Amara echoed, her voice steady despite the rising pulse in her throat. She took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving Whitlock's. "We'll see about that." Whitlock chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've been chasing shadows, Amara. Did you really think you'd stop me with this little operation of yours? You have no idea how deep this goes." His voice was smooth, almost amused, as though he had already calculated every possible outcome and knew he was untouchable. Amara's mind raced. She knew Whitlock was a master manipulator, always 2 steps ahead. But she had something he didn't expect: Hardman, and the evidence she had gathered. Whitlock might think he had won, but the night wasn't over yet. Hardman stepped forward, his gun raised, eyes locked on Whitlock. "You're going down, Whitlock. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Drop everything and surrender." Whitlock's smile faded slightly as he regarded Hardman with disdain. "And who do we have here?" "Ah, Officer Hardman, the loyal lapdog. Always doing the system's dirty work. I wonder, how does it feel to be a pawn in a game you don't even understand?" Hardman's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his gun. "I understand enough to know that your time's up." Whitlock's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't be so sure of that." In a flash, one of the guards lunged forward, but Amara was faster. She anticipated the move and sidestepped just in time, delivering a swift, precise blow to the man's throat, sending him crumpling to the ground, gasping for air. The second guard raised his weapon, but Hardman was already moving, his shot echoing through the warehouse as it hit the guard in the shoulder, causing him to drop his gun and fall to the ground. Whitlock didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Amara, as though the chaos around them was beneath his concern. "You're persistent," he said calmly, adjusting his suit jacket as if nothing had happened. "I'll give you that." Amara's chest heaved as she caught her breath, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She could see the calm in Whitlock's eyes, and it unnerved her. Why wasn't he panicking? He should be, with his guards down and no easy escape in sight. Yet, he stood there, as though he still held all the cards. "Enough of the games," Whitlock. Amara spat, taking a step closer. "I have everything I need to bury you. The accounts, the names, the transfers. It's all here. You're finished." Whitlock raised an eyebrow, as if mildly intrigued. "You think you've won, don't you? That you've exposed me? I admire your confidence, Amara. Truly I do. But you're forgetting something. You might have the evidence, but do you really think it will see the light of day?" Amara's heart sank, though she didn't show it. Whitlock had connections, deep ones. She knew that. Even with everything she had gathered, getting it into the right hands, without it being silenced or swept under the rug, would be a monumental task. But she had come too far to back down now. "I've already secured the files," Amara countered, though she knew that securing them wasn't enough. Whitlock would do everything in his power to make sure they never saw the light of day. "There's no way out for you." Whitlock's smile returned, but this time it was more calculated, colder. "Oh, Amara, you still don't get it. I own this city. The police, the politicians, the judges, they're all in my pocket. You think taking me down is going to change anything? You're fighting a battle that's already lost." Hardman stepped forward again, his frustration boiling over. "We'll see how much power you have when you're sitting in a cell for the rest of your life." Whitlock's eyes shifted to Hardman, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something contempt, perhaps. "You, officer, have no idea what's coming. You've been a pawn in this game from the beginning. They'll discard you the second you're no longer useful, just like they've discarded everyone before you." Amara could feel the tension in the air growing thicker. Whitlock's calm was starting to crack, but he still believed he held the upper hand. She needed to push him, to break through that arrogance and force him to act. "You think you've got it all figured out," Amara said, her voice low and deliberate, "but people like you always make the same mistake." Whitlock tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "And what mistake is that?" Amara took a step closer, her voice ice cold. "You underestimate people like me." Without warning, she reached into her jacket and pulled out the small drive she had hidden, the one with the most incriminating evidence against Whitlock. His eyes widened ever so slightly at the sight of it, the first sign of genuine alarm she had seen in him all night. "I've already sent this to multiple trusted sources," Amara continued, her tone unwavering. "Even if you kill me right here, right now, it's too late. The files will be leaked. Your whole operation will collapse." Whitlock's face darkened, the confidence draining from him as he realized she wasn't bluffing. His hands twitched slightly at his sides, his mind racing through possible options, possible ways out. But there were none. Not anymore. For the first time that night, Amara saw fear in his eyes. "You're lying," Whitlock said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. "Try me," Amara shot back. "You're finished, Whitlock, one way or another." The tension between them was electric, crackling in the air like a live wire. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire world had frozen in that instant, teetering on the edge of a precipice. And then, Whitlock's composure shattered. With a sudden, desperate motion, he lunged forward, grabbing for the drive in Amara's hand. But she was ready. In a split second, she sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back, slamming him face first into the metal table with a sickening thud. Whitlock groaned in pain, his body going limp as Amara pinned him down. Hardman rushed forward, handcuffs already out, as he quickly restrained Whitlock's wrists. "It's over," Amara hissed into Whitlock's ear, her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. "You're done." Whitlock said nothing, his face twisted in pain and defeat. He had played his final card, and he had lost. Hardman stepped back, his gun still drawn as he scanned the room for any remaining threats. But it was over. The guards were down, Whitlock was in custody, and the evidence was secure. Amara straightened up, taking a deep breath as the reality of the moment finally hit her. It was over. After months of chasing shadows, of working undercover, of risking everything, she had done it. Whitlock was finished. But there was no sense of triumph, no overwhelming joy, just a cold, quiet relief that it was finally over. Hardman holstered his gun and looked at her, his expression a mixture of respect and exhaustion. "You did it?" he said simply. Amara nodded, though she felt none of the satisfaction she had expected. "We did it," she corrected. They stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on them both. Outside, the distant wail of police sirens echoed through the streets, growing closer with each passing second. We'd better get ready, Hardman said, glancing toward the door. The cavalry's coming. Amara sighed, feeling the exhaustion in every bone of her body. Yeah, she muttered. Let's wrap this up. As the sirens drew nearer, Amara looked down at Whitlock, who was still groaning in pain on the floor. She had won the battle, but she knew the war wasn't over. There were still others like Whitlock out there, still more corruption to uncover. But for tonight, at least, one chapter had come to a close. The wail of sirens echoed louder as Amara stood outside the warehouse, breathing in the cool night air. The tension from the confrontation with Whitlock slowly ebbed away, leaving her body aching from the adrenaline crash. She watched as several police cars screeched to a stop at the curb, their red and blue lights flickering against the darkened windows of the warehouse. Uniformed officers quickly spilled out, their weapons drawn ready for action. But the action was over. Whitlock was in handcuffs, and his empire, built on corruption and deception, was beginning to crumble. Hardman stood beside her, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. He had been through hell tonight, and the weight of it was clear in his eyes. They had both crossed lines they never expected to cross. For Hardman, it was a realization that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules he had sworn to uphold. For Amara, it was another step in her relentless pursuit of justice, knowing that there would always be another battle ahead. As the police entered the warehouse to secure the scene, Amara glanced over at Hardman. "You did good back there," she said quietly, her voice tinged with genuine respect. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. I won't forget that." Hardman shook his head, still processing everything that had happened. "I didn't do it for you," he muttered. "I did it because I couldn't stand by and watch someone like Whitlock keep getting away with it. This city's rotten, and it's people like him that are the reason why." Amara nodded, understanding more than he realized. "It's not over, you know. There are more like him. People who think they can control everything and everyone." "Yeah," Hardman sighed. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Whitlock was led out of the warehouse by two officers, his hands cuffed behind his back. His face was a mask of cold fury, but there was also a flicker of something else in his eyes, fear. He had always thought himself untouchable, but now, for the first time, the reality of his situation was sinking in. He was finished. Amara stepped forward, meeting Whitlock's gaze as he was pushed toward a waiting police car. For a moment, they locked eyes, two adversaries who had played a high-stakes game of cat and mouse for months. And Whitlock's arrogance had always been his armor, but now, standing in handcuffs, he looked smaller, defeated. "You think this is over, don't you?" Whitlock sneered, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won. But I have friends in high places, people who won't let this stand. This isn't the end." Amara didn't flinch. She had heard similar threats before, from men who thought they could buy their way out of anything. But she had something stronger than their influence, evidence, and the will to see it through. "This is the end," Amara said calmly, her eyes hard. "You're done, Whitlock. And your friends in high places? They're next." Whitlock's sneer faltered, and the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty streets. As the car pulled away, taking Whitlock to face his reckoning, Amara felt a strange sense of closure. The battle had been long and grueling, but she had done it. She had brought him down. But deep down, she knew this was only one victory in a much larger war. The streets were quiet now, the flashing lights from the police cars casting long shadows as the officers began to clear the scene. Amara turned to Hardman, who was watching Whitlock's car disappear into the distance. "So, what now?" Hardman asked, his voice rough from the night's exertion. Amara gave him a small, tired smile. Now we make sure the evidence sticks. There'll be trials, investigations, a lot of cleanup. And there are still people out there connected to this. We'll have to keep going after them, one by one. Hardman ran a hand over his face, exhaustion seeping into his bones. I don't know if I've got the stomach for more of this, he admitted. I've spent my whole career trying to do things by the book, and look where that got me.
Amara nodded, her expression softening. It's not easy, and it never gets easier. But the system only changes if people like you are willing to stand up, even when it feels like everything's working against you. Hardman let out a long breath. Yeah, maybe. He paused, looking at her with something close to admiration. You're one hell of a woman, you know that? Amara chuckled softly. I've been called worse. They shared a brief moment of understanding, two people from different worlds who had been thrown together in the midst of chaos, and somehow they had come out the other side. But Amara knew this was where their paths diverged again. She had her mission, and Hardman had his life to return to. As the last of the police cars pulled away, Amara glanced down at her phone, a new message lighting up the screen. It was from one of her contacts, a lead on the next target in the corruption network. There was always another step to take, another piece of the puzzle to solve. I have to go, she said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. There's still work to be done. Hardman nodded, though his expression showed the weight of what they had just been through. Will I see you again? Amara paused, considering the question. Maybe, if I need someone who knows how to handle a situation like this. Hardman gave her a tired smile. You know where to find me. With that, Amara turned and walked into the night, her figure disappearing into the shadows. The city stretched out before her, broken, corrupt, but still worth fighting for. There were battles ahead, and she was ready for them, because as long as people like Whitlock existed, she would never stop. The sirens faded into the distance, and for the first time in a long while, Amara allowed herself a small sense of peace. This fight was over, but the war would go on, and she would be there in the shadows, ready for whatever came next.